everyone, I'm Colombe and this is Andrea.
Hello.
And we are the hosts of How to Build a Country. Today is season 0, episode 4, and the title is a revolution unfolding and is it a bad thing? It's not a bad thing, we can already tell you. And just to give you a bit of background, we've been creating those episodes for quite a few weeks now with the idea of exploring with you how to build a democratic system of global governance, basically a democratic global country. And so in episode 1, we looked at how countries were created. We looked at borders, currencies. In episode 2, we looked at the successes and failures, many failures, of the current global order, looking at the UN, at the EU, and what we can learn from it, because you have to know your enemies to be able to overcome them and create something democratic. And last week, we looked at space exploration and how to tax appropriately multinational companies, and the fact that to do so, we actually need a global democratic governance. But now, how do we do it? How do we create it? We obviously have our theories, a lot of campaigns on it, but we have to admit that a lot of change, a lot of social change comes from revolutions. And so we thought, okay, let's look at revolutions. Let's look at how they happen. Let's look at the factors that create revolutions. And let's understand whether we are at a moment in history where revolutions are brewing.
So spoiler alert again, yes, they are. So let's focus on this because revolutions are very important and we might have a big one just in front of our eyes. So let's first agree on a definition. There are obviously many definitions of revolutions. In a simple way, a revolution is an activity or a movement designed to effect fundamental change in a socio-economic situation. So basically, there is unhappiness, there is social injustice, there are groups of people that are not listened to, and they trigger certain change. And trigger can be a protest, a march, a fundamental decision of a certain community in behaving a certain way. And this decision, boom, change the world, change everything around them. And suddenly we have a new system, a new socioeconomic situation where things are different.
Yeah, I think also some of the factors that create revolutions are, for example, widening inequalities.
Absolutely.
This leads to heavy discontent. The fact that populations feel unheard by their representatives, by the political elite. You also have a feeling of discontent and hopelessness with an overall situation, a feeling of discrimination. So you have quite a few recurring factors that we see in many revolutions. Normally, it's a group is left behind by another group benefiting from a sort of injustice a lot of the time. And this means that people suddenly, often it's not so sudden, it's decades in the making, but you suddenly have an event and people come together and demand change.
Absolutely. So the example we want to take today is the one of the Suffragette.
Yeah.
An incredible movement that started at the beginning of the last century in the United Kingdom and basically resulted with women achieving the right to vote. That's an incredible achievement in just 20-25 years of struggle. So let me give you a bit of context. So imagine to be projected back 100 years from now, 120 years from now. We are in a society where in a few countries the vote for women is starting to be granted, for example in New Zealand, but in most places women are not heard, not listened to, and they have absolutely no rights to express their views. So it's a very, very patriarchal society.
Basically Vatican today.
Basically Vatican today.
I had to bring it about. It's the only country where women don't have the right to vote, so...
Fully agree on that. So suddenly there's a group of women that says, enough is enough. Obviously I'm simplifying, but this is what happened. In 1903, the group that was then to be known as Suffragette started to campaign publicly for women to gain their right to vote. They were bashed, they were attacked, they were shamed by the public opinion. And actually the name Suffragette came in 1906 when the Daily Mail, one popular newspaper here in the UK, used the terminology to basically make a mockery. And they owned the terminology and started to campaign under it and actually published their own newspaper with the name. For the 10 years from basically 1903 before the First World War in 1914, the Suffragette increased a lot their pressure on the public, both through public advocacy and then direct action. For example, by making bomb blow up in London and doing very strong public march to protest against the patriarchy. In 1913...
They were also imprisoned a lot, right?
Yes.
I just remember reading about how they were systematically imprisoned, went on hunger strikes together, and then were force-fed.
Absolutely. So a very, very horrible situation that we should all be this country should be ashamed of. In a key moment was in 1913 when Emily Davison, one of member of the suffragette movement, was killed during the Epsom Derby, so basically a horse race, and she was killed by running in front of the king horse, and as a protest, but unfortunately she died, and this image went viral, so it was one of the first viral protests in the world across the planet, and this increased exponentially the support of the suffragette and the pressure on the British government to change the legislations. Then the
First World War started.
The First World War started, and so during this time the protest stopped.
But I guess that the public consciousness about the role of women in society grew stronger, right? Because in all countries involved in the war, suddenly women were the main workforce in the country, were working in factories, had so much power, and then men came back from the war, women went back to like before war times, and yet their rights didn't actually improve.
Absolutely. And that meant that by the time that the war finished, so in 1918, the public opinion was ready for a big change. So there was a first legislation that gave some voting rights to some women, mostly educated, so about 30 years old. But that was just the start of the change. By 1928, when the Equal Franchise Act was passed, all women above 21, that was the legal age at the time, were allowed the right to vote. So a massive change in the space of a generation.
And this was due to a revolution, to women creating a revolution for women's rights. And some men participated. As the joke goes, not all men.
We just discussed a very positive example of revolution. It's just one. The fight against apartheid, the sunflower movement in Taiwan. These are all examples of very positive revolution that happened almost in our lifetime for most of them. And you find countless examples of that.
And to go back to the definition we gave of a revolution, it's an activity or movement designed to effect fundamental changes in the social economic situation that often, ideally, leads to a sudden radical or complete change in institution, political organization, or something like this. So the suffragette movement was an incredibly successful revolution. And as soon as you say that, people were like, yeah, I mean, the moderate ones, because the radicals, they killed people, etc. But if you look at the anti-apartheid struggle, it's the same thing. In a revolution, you have to have the moderates that are acceptable in the eyes of the establishment, the radicals that give them acceptability in the eyes of the establishment because they look like the crazy ones when they're just advocating for their rights, and so on, that work together and work not together as well, but basically advance the cause. And it has to be radical, and it's not pleasant. Any protest, any rise against an oppressor, if it has to happen, means the oppressor doesn't want to stop oppressing. Yeah. So it's gonna make people uncomfortable, and it should. And if it doesn't make you uncomfortable, or if the status quo doesn't make you uncomfortable, and you don't feel like fighting, maybe you should be wondering what you're actually gaining from an unfair system.
Exactly. I think that's exactly a point. So if you don't embrace revolution, probably you are the problem.
We're talking about revolutions for like less inequalities, more rights, and so on, by the way.
Exactly. Actually, so let's jump into today's revolution, or what we believe it might happen.
At the beginning of the week, you told me something super interesting. You told me in the last 10 years, there's been more social movements, protests, and so on than in the previous 10 years.
And I'll tell you even more. I think in the 20s, so we're just 2 years into the 20s, the amount of revolution you find referred to online are probably higher than in the 10 years and 20 years before. But there is a clear trend. I think if you do research, there is a very clear trend that in the last few years, things are really boiling up.
And I think that's due to a few things. In the last few years, we have widening inequalities. And I think this is true both at the global level, and people across the world feel it, and at the national level. So at the global level, I've done quite a bit of research. I've looked at research by Oxfam, by the IMF, and so on. So one global inequality, just to define it, is the unequal distribution of resources, opportunities, and power that shape well-being among the 8 billion people we are right now on the planet. So Oxfam did a quite interesting survey. I'm reading out of it, by the way. In the early 1800s, individuals worldwide had more similar living standards, and differences in wealth and income were closer. Global inequality grew substantially after the Industrial Revolution, sparking rapid income growth in Western Europe, in the US, in Australia, in Canada and New Zealand, as compared with incomes in other countries.
Okay.
if you fast forward to today, the 10 richest men in the world own more than the bottom 3.1 billion people.
Incredible.
So, and even the World Bank said global inequality is on the rise for the first time in decades because the poorest 40% of the world lost twice as much income as the wealthiest 20% during the global pandemic.
I mean, these are a clear
It's
indicator
insane.
that the situation cannot continue.
It's completely insane.
However you look at them, it's not true that everyone is getting wealthier and fatter and happier. It's not.
Do you correlate fat and happy?
I feel like in popular perception could be, but it's not true. Definitely, people die less of cholera than 100 years ago. But that's not a solution. That's not meaning that we are all doing very well.
Yeah, I think there's something which is the standards of living over rising and absolute poverty diminishing versus inequalities widening.
Exactly.
And when you have, it's good that we have less overall absolute poverty, but inequalities widening when you see, again, like the 10 richest men in the world, men, by the way, obviously, own more than the bottom 3.1 billion people. 3.1 billion people.
Incredible.
That's insane. Like,
shocking.
how is this, when people are dying of hunger, war, climate, how is this a planet in which we can live? That's insane. So that's worldwide. I thought we would also give an example of a nation because we often feel it as well very strongly in countries, right? So Andrea and I are based in the UK. So I looked at the UK. So the wealthiest 10% of households owned 43% of all of the wealth in Britain between April 2018 to March 2020. So 10% of households in Britain own 43% of the wealth.
Is so wrong. I mean, that's exactly why a society crumbles. Is when people hoard wealth, they don't let it go, and just because of that they are wealthy, they become wealthier, and the others are left out. And
that's the main, I think that's also one of the main points. Right now, from what I read from those reports, if you work really, really hard, and you won't have a chance to actually get rich, because people that get rich, it's thanks to wealth that was accumulated previously. Because wages and so on are not going up, they're relatively stable, yet the rest is going up. Sorry for this super simple explanation. I'm not an economist.
I think it was perfect and to the point. And this is not the only problem. Inequalities are a massive driver of dissatisfaction and then change. But there are other things that are clearly pointing at the need for change in our societies. And I isolated two that I think are quite interesting. One is democratic participation. And obviously I'm only looking at democratic countries. But there is a consistent decline across the planet of turnout at elections. That means that it's not that we are only in love with dictators, but that means that basically the current democratic structures are not appealing to us, are not responding to our needs. And when I say us, I'm saying the majority of the population. There is a very clear decline, for example, from the 60s when around 77% worldwide in democracy would turn out at the election. Now the average is 67. So we lost 10% in just the span of 1 or 2 generations in terms of turnout. And these numbers are even stronger when you go and look at the drivers behind them. So for example, again, let's take the United Kingdom as was based here. The trust in government declined from 38% in 1986 to 15% in 2019. So less than half in little more than 30 years.
I'm really happy you say that, because normally when we talk about voter turnout, I hear so much like older people say, oh, but the youth is not going to vote. I think the truth is, from the moment the democratic structure no longer works for you, from the moment you don't feel represented, you don't feel like the institutions are fit for purpose, you don't feel like you have enough of a say, voting every 5 years is not democracy. You have to have more than this. You have to be able to participate in more ways, to be represented in more ways. Unless you have this, then you don't have trust in governments, and then you're not going to be bothered. You're going to be like, well, it's the same old, it's not going to change. Yeah.
There are also political examples of them, of changes, and we saw them during this week in Iran, in China, many examples. But we can also find some in, for example, in Western societies.
Let me start by saying that I don't think we can make the world a better place unless we have full parity. And this means at least 50% of elected officials that are non-males, at least, because the world has been ruled forever by men, and it's caused so many issues. It's not that men are worse or whatever, it's the fact that people are not represented, that women are not represented, that other genders are not represented, which leads to more sexism, to more discrimination, to more violence, and so on. You need full representation in politics for politics to work. And this is from gender to race to sexual orientation. You need everyone represented. and there's obviously a lot more characteristics. Women across the world, it's extremely hard to go into politics. I think it's like 80% of parliamentarians have been sexually harassed or aggressed, right? Of female parliamentarians, sorry. It's an insane number, 80%. It's going into politics is extremely hard. And this is when you made it. To get into it, you have to overcome so many barriers, from access to funds to being taken seriously, to blatant sexism, harassment, rape threats, all of it. And it gets worse from country to country. In 1995, only 11% of all parliamentarians across the world were women. Only. Today, it's only 26%. I'm saying only, it's obviously an improvement, but it's only 26%. And people are like, oh, but this is a great step forward. Yeah, obviously, it's better than 11%. Yeah. It's obviously an improvement. And you see this along race in the US Congress and Senate. You have more diversity as well, thanks to caucuses, thanks to the fact that, society is slowly less and less horrible. But still, there's such a long way to go. Absolutely. And this for me is when revolutions are brewing. I remember so many conversations with parents, grandparents and so on, telling me, but look, things are getting better. It's much better for you than it was for me. Okay, great. That's not a standard. Like, for me, the standard is not the lowest common denominator.
Absolutely.
Things are unacceptable. From the moment that I know that in my lifetime, I have 99.9% risk of getting sexually assaulted, that the risk for me and the chances of getting into politics are completely different than for men, that the standards, the wage gap and so on exist, that's not progress. Nothing short of equality is acceptable. And I'm taking this example after the point on the suffragette movement and how it brought about radical change, because I think that nothing less today than radical change is acceptable. Enough, yeah. And I think that this is when we see that a revolution is brewing. When you have widening inequalities, loss of trust in governments, when you have authoritarian countries becoming more and more authoritarian and reaching out outside. If you look at the CCP in China, threatening Taiwan after it completely cracked down on Hong Kong and so on. It's when revolutions start, because there's no other choice.
I fully agree. I think that that's exactly what we're trying to isolate today, right? To show that the current situation is untenable and things are changing. And now let's think about the future. Let's think about what could happen very soon. There could be this tipping moment, this moment that push all the energies together and start the revolution. I found three. One is a sad one and a very dangerous one. There is China invading Taiwan. So there could be a trigger moment where the current world order, for that is creaky and clearly not holding up very well, might finally collapse. And this could lead to massive wars on one side, which I hope not. Or this might lead even to change of regime in certain authoritarian countries because the backlash will be too strong, even for dictators to handle. So that could definitely be something.
That's again something that we hope will never happen, right?
Exactly.
or I think also the other way, like the international community waking up to the fact that they have to support Taiwan, that Taiwan needs to be recognized as a full member of intergovernmental organizations like the UN, that Taiwan can help, has a lot to share and a lot to provide the world. And this would lead to a change in the way we see the world.
Yeah, I fully agree. And this is just an example, but actually another big change could be the change of regime in Russia or similar big dictatorship. So also simply the democratization of big non-democratic power could be a tipping point to democratize the whole world. So another massive revolution. Or in another realm, another space, for example, we could witness in 2024 the first female president in the United States. I mean, Biden is very old, Kamala Harris is the vice president, the Democrats might win, and that means that finally we might see in the most important democracy of the planet a female president. Do you think this would be a tipping point, Colombe?
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of other potential trigger events from, simply the economic situation across the world that keeps on getting worse while the wealthier get wealthier, that our democracies no longer function properly, that we are not being heard, that there's a clear discontent and no response unless something changes. And I really hope that, those who benefit from the current system will try to change it and will accept that it's needed. Unless this happens, at one point, a revolution is going to take place and is needed.
So the message that we have for this show is that first, revolution happened in history, and not all of them, but some brought amazing change to our planet and a lot of the rights we have. Second, today's societies are showing the symptoms of the need for a revolution. Injustices are boiling, positive and negative trends are increasing and become very clear. So it's very likely that sooner or later things will have to change. So our hope, and the hope of hopefully the people that are following us, is that we can trigger a positive revolution that dismantle all the injustices that we have discussed before, hopefully without massive violence or anything like that. And in the next few years, we'll see a different societies emerging from the crumbling layers of the one we live into. Because it's definitely been too long with this same patriarchal, colonialist, authoritarian system in place, and it cannot continue forever.
So that's our show. A revolution is clearly boiling. The question is, will you stand with it or against it? Send us your thoughts, send us your comments, send us all of your ideas. Don't forget to share, like, and all of this sharing is caring. And we hope to see you next week on How to Build a Country.
Thank you.